Good afternoon and welcome to the Free West YouTube channel. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please do so and follow our commentary and interesting interviews. Now today we're talking about the growing rift between the USA and the European Union over Ukraine. Recently there was a summit in London, but it was actually a crashed summit because nothing constructive came out of it. What was once envisioned as a high-level summit in London, replete with diplomatic gravitas and promises of unity, has devolved into a hastily staged crisis cabaret. Key players are cancelling one after another, leaving the stage to secondary figures scrambling to salvage a crumbling narrative. The event, meant to showcase Western resolve, now lays bare the fractures in the transatlantic alliance and the unraveling of its Ukraine strategy. In a dark room tucked away in London's diplomatic basement, far from the opulent halls of the Foreign Office, security advisors from the UK, France, Germany, the US and Ukraine are convening. What was initially planned as a prestigious summit where heads of state and foreign ministers would hammer out bold solutions has been reduced to a makeshift gathering of mid-level operatives. Foreign ministers are conspicuously absent, and expectations for meaningful decisions have evaporated. The Western approach to Ukraine has entered a state of advanced decay, a microcosm of the broader disintegration of the transatlantic order. The absence of US Secretary of State Marco Rubio is particularly telling. While Kiev continues to issue strident demands for ironclad security guarantees, and rejects any territorial compromises, the Trump administration in Washington is executing a quiet but seismic shift in policy. Rather than delivering a breakthrough in negotiations, Rubio has signaled a sweeping overhaul of the State Department, prioritizing domestic restructuring over foreign entanglements. This move underscores a broader American pivot, a retreat from the role of global policeman and financier of endless conflicts. According to an internal memo, no closures of US consulates are imminent. However, a leaked draft of an executive order hints at future scrutiny of overseas missions, particularly in regions deemed peripheral to current US foreign policy priorities. This could eventually include consulates in Europe, a prospect that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. The political message is unmistakable. The United States is withdrawing, not only militarily but also diplomatically, from commitments that no longer serve its immediate interests. Ukraine, clinging to a fading illusion. The US withdrawal from the Ukraine dossier is even more pronounced. Keith Kellogg, a relatively obscure figure in Washington's foreign policy circles, has been dispatched as the sole American representative to London. His mission is unenviable: to confront Kiev with a harsh new reality. The United States will no longer allow itself to be cast as the primary financier and enabler of a protracted war. This marks a stark departure from the Biden era, when billions in aid and weapons flowed to Ukraine with little public debate. Kiev's response to Washington's recalibrated stance is defiant, bordering on self-destructive. Economy Minister Yulia Sviridenko has declared that, quote, "The Ukrainian people will not accept a frozen conflict," unquote, a statement that resonates domestically, but ignores the shifting geopolitical landscape. Instead of pursuing NATO membership, a goal increasingly seen as unattainable, Kiev is now demanding binding security guarantees that amount to perpetual Western military patronage. Yet these demands come without the political concessions necessary to make them feasible, such as acknowledging Russian control over Crimea or the Donbas regions. Such rhetoric may rally domestic support, but it exposes a leadership bereft of a viable Plan B in a world where American backing is no longer guaranteed. Ukraine's economic fragility compounds its predicament. More than 50% of the national budget is propped up by foreign aid, with the US historically serving as the largest donor. If Washington scales back or withdraws entirely, the consequences could be catastrophic. By 2025, Ukraine risks defaulting on salaries and pensions, triggering state bankruptcy, a collapse of the hryvnia, and widespread social unrest. The country's infrastructure, already battered by years of conflict, teeters on the edge of collapse, with energy grids and transportation networks particularly vulnerable. Without a steady infusion of external funds, Ukraine's ability to sustain its war effort or even basic governance hangs by a thread. Historical context. The roots of disarray. To understand the current unraveling, one must look to the historical roots of the transatlantic commitment to Ukraine. The 2014 Maidan uprising, followed by Russia's annexation of Crimea and the outbreak of war in Donbas, galvanized Western support for Kiev. NATO and the EU positioned themselves as staunch defenders of Ukrainian sovereignty, framing the conflict as a test of democratic values against authoritarian aggression. The US, under both Obama and Biden, led the charge, funneling billions in military and economic aid, while imposing sweeping sanctions on Russia. But this unity was always fragile, masking divergent interests. For the US, Ukraine was a geopolitical buffer against Russia, a way to project power in Europe's east. For European powers like Germany and France, the conflict posed economic risks, disrupted energy supplies, trade losses, and refugee flows, tempering their enthusiasm for escalation. Meanwhile, smaller European states, haunted by their own histories with Moscow, pushed for maximalist support for Kiev, often out of step with the cautious pragmatism of Berlin and Paris. The election of Donald Trump in 2024 shattered this uneasy coalition. Trump's America First doctrine, which prioritizes domestic concerns and bilateral deals over multilateral alliances, has upended the assumptions underpinning Western unity. His skepticism of NATO, coupled with a willingness to negotiate directly with Moscow, has left European allies scrambling to adapt. The London talks, far from reinforcing transatlantic solidarity, highlight the growing chasm between Washington's strategic retrenchment and Europe's ideological commitment to Ukraine. So the shine is gone. The London talks do not herald the dawn of a solution, but the twilight of an illusion. The era of transatlantic cohesion is over, fractured by competing priorities and eroded trust. Washington is charting a strategic bilateral course, prioritizing its own interests over ideological crusades. Europe, tethered to outdated visions of moral leadership, clings to rhetorical flourishes that mask its material weaknesses, and Kiev, defiant yet vulnerable, teeters on the edge of economic collapse, political isolation, and military defeat. The deeper question is not whether a peace deal will emerge, But who will bear the cost of this failure? Will it be Ukraine, abandoned by its Western patrons and forced to confront its own fragility? Or Europe, left to grapple with the fallout of a destabilized neighbor and a resurgent Russia? Or perhaps the transatlantic alliance itself, exposed as a hollow shell incapable of weathering the storms of a multipolar world? For now, the London talks are less about peace than survival. They are a distress call from a West that has lost its bearings, grappling with the reality that the old world order no longer holds. The answer to this crisis remains elusive, and as the cabaret plays on, the audience, both in Kiev and beyond, waits anxiously for the final act. Brussels is on borrowed time, strategies without substance. Europe, caught off guard by America's pivot, is struggling to fill the void. The EU's $50 billion Ukraine facility, intended to support Kiev through 2027, is already fully committed, with little prospect of additional funds. Raising more money is politically contentious, particularly without reciprocal concessions from Kiev, such as progress on corruption reforms or territorial compromises. Military aid, meanwhile, faces legal and logistical hurdles. Behind closed doors, European diplomats are resorting to creative accounting and legal loopholes to sustain weapons deliveries, but these are stopgap measures at best. The idea of confiscating frozen Russian assets, once touted as a bold solution, has faltered. Legal experts warn of protracted court battles, while Moscow has vowed severe retaliation, including reciprocal asset seizures and economic countermeasures. The risks outweigh the potential gains, leaving European policymakers with few viable options. Europe's military vulnerabilities are equally glaring. Without US logistical support, tanker aircraft, strategic transport, satellite intelligence, NATO's European members are woefully unprepared for sustained conflict. France and Germany, despite their rhetoric, lack the capabilities to lead a robust defense effort. The UK, while projecting confidence, is stretched thin, its forces diminished by years of budget cuts. The London negotiations, cloaked in diplomatic niceties, are little more than an exercise in symbolic damage control, papering over Europe's strategic impotence. Rumors are swirling that the French President Emmanuel Macron and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer are quietly warming to Trump's Ukraine plan, which reportedly includes de-escalation, recognition of Russian territorial gains, and a phased reduction of sanctions. Such a shift would mark a dramatic reversal, but it reflects the pragmatic recognition that Europe cannot sustain Ukraine alone. Yet Kiev's influential lobby, backed by hawkish voices in Washington and Eastern Europe, is fighting tooth and nail to derail this pivot, even at the risk of alienating its dwindling pool of allies. If you've listened up to now, please click the button to subscribe to Free West Media YouTube channel. And until next time, thank you very much.